sergeant screamed into his radio for the 4th time, but all he got back was static. 43 Marines stranded in the middle of the Mojave with no GPS, no cell signal, and a sun that had already started to dip behind the western ridgeline. "We're done," one of the younger corporals muttered, staring at the blank screen of his navigation tablet. "We're actually done." And that's when a 68-year-old man with sun-cracked hands and a faded boonie hat stepped forward and said 5 words that nobody expected. "I know the way home." If you believe that real skill never expires, comment Pathfinder right now, and let's get into this story. Staff Sergeant Derek Holt had been running land navigation exercises in the high desert for 3 years. He knew the terrain like the back of his hand, or at least he thought he did. The exercise was supposed to be routine, a 72-hour patrol simulation through a grid sector southeast of 29 Palms, the kind of thing his platoon had done a dozen times before. But this time, there was one difference. Battalion had attached a civilian volunteer to the unit as part of a new veteran mentorship initiative. His name was Ray Caldwell. He was 68 years old, lean as a fence post, and moved with the careful, measured steps of someone whose knees had seen better decades. He wore old desert boots that looked like they'd been through a war, which, as it turned out, they had. Most of the Marines didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't a contractor. He wasn't an instructor. He was listed on the manifest simply as a veteran volunteer advisor, which to the younger guys meant he was someone's grandfather who had pulled some strings to tag along. Nobody briefed them on who he actually was. Nobody thought it mattered. The first day went according to plan. The platoon moved through the checkpoints using their GPS units and digital mapping tablets, logging waypoints and coordinates like a textbook exercise. Ray walked near the back of the formation, saying almost nothing. He carried a small pack, a canteen, and what looked like a battered old lensatic compass that he wore on a lanyard around his neck. A couple of the Marines made quiet jokes about it. Lance Corporal Vega nudged his buddy and whispered, "Dude brought a compass from Vietnam." They laughed. Ray heard them. He didn't react. He just kept walking, his eyes scanning the horizon in a slow, methodical sweep that none of them recognized as anything significant. When they stopped for water, Ray crouched near a rock formation and studied the ground for a long moment. Sergeant Holt walked past him and barely glanced down. "You good, sir?" he asked, more out of obligation than concern. Ray nodded. "Ground's telling you something," he said quietly. Holt didn't ask what. He didn't have time for riddles from a man who probably hadn't been in the field since before he was born. The trouble started on the second night. They had moved into a sector that sat inside a narrow electromagnetic dead zone, a corridor between 2 ridgelines where GPS signals had always been spotty. But this time, it wasn't just spotty. It was gone. Every single unit in the platoon lost signal within a 15-minute window. Tablets went dark. The Blue Force tracker flickered and died. Even the backup handheld receivers showed nothing but zeros. Holt called it in on the radio, but the response from the command post was garbled and broken. All he could make out was the word "stand by." That was the last transmission they received clearly. After that, it was just hiss and silence. The platoon stopped moving. Holt gathered his team leaders around a flat rock and tried to figure out their position, using the last known coordinates, but the terrain around them looked the same in every direction. Low scrub, loose sand, dark ridge lines fading into a sky that was quickly turning black. Corporal Jennings pulled out a paper map, the kind they were supposed to carry but rarely used. He spread it on the rock and stared at it like it was written in another language. "I don't even know which direction we came from," he admitted quietly. Nobody laughed. The temperature was dropping fast, and the reality of their situation was starting to settle in. That was when Ray Caldwell walked up to the circle of team leaders without being invited. He stood at the edge of the group, his hands resting calmly at his sides, and looked at the map for about 10 seconds. Then he looked up at the sky, then back at the map. "You're 2 kilometers southeast of where you think you are," he said. His voice was calm, almost casual, like he was telling someone the time. Holt looked at him with a mixture of annoyance and disbelief. "With all due respect, sir, we've got trained navigators working the problem." Ray didn't argue. He just pointed at a low saddle between 2 ridgelines to the northwest. "That saddle lines up with the notch on your map at grid reference 472819. If I'm wrong, you'll know within 20 minutes of walking." He paused. "And if I'm right, Your base camp is 11 kilometers on a bearing of 320 from that saddle." Holt stared at him. Jennings stared at the map. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Vega, the same lance corporal who had joked about the compass, broke the silence. "How do you know that?" Ray didn't look at him. He pointed up. "Polaris is sitting right above that ridge. Orion's belt is 30 degrees off the eastern horizon, which means it's approximately 21:40 local time. The wind has been coming from the northwest all day, which matches the seasonal pattern for this valley. And that rock formation behind you has a specific erosion pattern that only occurs on south-facing slopes in this elevation band." He lowered his hand. "I've been reading this desert since before your parents met." The silence that followed was the kind that rearranges a room. Holt looked at his team leaders. They looked at him. Nobody had a better plan. Nobody had any plan at all. The GPS was dead, the radio was dead, and they were standing in a dark desert with 43 people who needed to get back to base before the exercise window closed and a search and rescue operation launched. Holt swallowed his pride. "All right," he said. "Show us." Ray nodded once, pulled the old compass off his lanyard and held it up. The glass was cracked. The bezel was scratched so badly you could barely read the markings. But the needle still moved. He tapped it twice with his finger, watched it settle, and then adjusted his bearing against the stars. "Stay in a column," he said. "Keep 5-meter spacing, watch your footing. I'll call the halts." And then he started walking. Not fast, not slow, just steady, like a man who had done this 1,000 times before because he had. They walked for 2 hours through terrain that looked featureless to everyone except Ray. He navigated by things the Marines couldn't see. A slight change in the texture of the sand, the angle of dried brush leaning in the prevailing wind direction, the way certain rock outcroppings cast shadows under the moonlight that told him exactly which face was oriented north. Every 30 minutes he stopped, looked at the sky, checked his broken compass, and made a slight correction to their heading. He didn't use a map. He didn't ask for one. The map was in his head, and it had been there for 40 years. At one point, the column had to cross a dry wash that cut across their path. Holt wanted to go around it to the east, where the banks looked lower. Ray shook his head. "East bank is soft sand for 300 meters. It'll cost you an hour and burn your guys' legs. Cross here where the gravel bed is firm, 20 meters wide, then you're on hardpack again." Holt looked at the wash. In the darkness, it all looked the same, but he'd made his decision to trust the old man, and he wasn't going to second-guess it now. They crossed where Ray said. The gravel bed was exactly where he said it would be. 20 meters of firm ground, then hardpack on the other side. Not a single Marine slipped. Around midnight, they reached the saddle that Ray had pointed out 3 hours earlier. From the top, you could see a faint glow on the horizon to the northwest. It was base camp, 11 kilometers away, just like he said. Jennings checked the map coordinates against the terrain features and confirmed it. Grid reference 472819. Exact. He looked at Ray with an expression that was somewhere between awe and embarrassment. "How?" was all he could manage. Ray sat down on a rock and took a slow drink from his canteen. "I was a pathfinder," he said, like that explained everything. And for the men who knew what that word meant, it did, but most of them didn't. Pathfinders were the soldiers who went in before everyone else, before the infantry, before the armor, before the helicopters. They dropped into unmarked territory, often alone or in teams of 2 or 3, and they mapped the landing zones, marked the safe corridors, and guided entire battalions into position, using nothing but a compass, a map, and the stars. They were the ones who found the way when there was no way, and Ray Caldwell had been one of the best. They pushed through the remaining kilometers in a steady march, arriving at the perimeter of base camp at 0345. The sentries on duty couldn't believe what they were seeing. A full platoon walking in from the dark desert in perfect formation, on schedule, with no GPS and no radio contact for over 8 hours. The duty officer came out of the command tent still pulling on his blouse. "Holt, how the hell did you get back? We were about to launch the QRF." Holt didn't hesitate. He pointed at Ray. Him. The duty officer looked at the old man standing quietly at the edge of the formation, his cracked compass still hanging from the lanyard around his neck, and frowned. "The volunteer?" Holt nodded. "He navigated us the entire way, 11 kilometers through a dead zone using star positions, terrain association, and a compass that belongs in a museum. Every bearing was exact. Every terrain call was right. not a single correction needed. The duty officer stared at Ray for a long moment. "What unit were you with?" he asked. Ray looked at him with steady eyes. 8th Infantry Division, Pathfinder Detachment, 1968 to 72. 3 tours. The duty officer's expression changed. He straightened slightly, almost involuntarily, the way military men do when they realize they're standing in front of someone who outranks their experience by decades. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. By breakfast, everyone knew the story. The old volunteer who had walked an entire platoon out of a dead zone using nothing but the stars and a broken compass. Marines who had barely acknowledged Ray the day before were now approaching him with questions, with respect, with the kind of quiet reverence that the military reserves for people who have truly earned it. But it was what happened at the after-action review that morning that changed everything. Colonel Marcus Webb, the battalion commander, had driven out from the main post to debrief the exercise personally. He was a tall man with sharp eyes and a reputation for not tolerating excuses. When he walked into the briefing tent, he expected to hear about equipment failures and recovery procedures. What he got instead was a story about a 68-year-old pathfinder who had done in one night what an entire platoon of GPS-dependent Marines could not. Webb listened to Holt's report without interruption. Then he turned to Ray, who was sitting in the back of the tent trying to be invisible. "Mr. Caldwell," the colonel said, "stand up, please." Ray stood slowly, his knees protesting the movement. "Staff Sergeant Holt tells me you navigated his platoon 11 kilometers through a GPS-denied environment using celestial navigation and terrain association." Ray nodded. "Yes, sir." Webb studied him. "Pathfinder School? Fort Benning?" "Yes, sir. Class of 68. "And you did 3 tours as a Pathfinder in Vietnam?" "Yes, sir." Webb was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made the entire tent go still. "I've read about you." Every head in the room turned. Ray blinked. "Sir?" Webb reached into his briefing folder and pulled out a printed page. "When Battalion approved the mentorship program, I reviewed the files of every volunteer. Your file came across my desk with a note from a retired brigadier general who served with you in the Central Highlands. He described you as the single best land navigator he ever encountered in 40 years of service." The colonel paused. He also noted that you were awarded the Silver Star for leading a reconnaissance element through 12 kilometers of enemy-controlled jungle at night to mark a landing zone that enabled the extraction of 67 wounded soldiers. No GPS, no illumination, no margin for error. You brought every single one of them home. The tent was silent. Ray stood there, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere on the far wall. 43 Marines stared at him, and not one of them was laughing about the compass anymore. Vega, the lance corporal who had cracked jokes about the old man's gear, was sitting in the front row. His face was pale. He looked like someone had just told him he'd been mocking a living legend to his face, because that's exactly what he had done. Holt stood off to the side, arms crossed, staring at the ground. He was thinking about every moment he had dismissed Ray, every time he had walked past the old man without asking a single question, every opportunity he had missed to learn from someone who carried more knowledge in his weathered hands than a rack full of digital equipment. Webb wasn't finished. He turned to the assembled Marines. "What happened last night is going to become a case study," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Not because your equipment failed. Equipment will always fail. It failed in Korea. It failed in Vietnam. It failed in Fallujah. It will fail again. What makes this significant is that when it did fail, not one of you had the skills to compensate. Not one. You had a paper map and couldn't use it. You had a sky full of stars and didn't know what they meant. You had terrain features all around you and couldn't read a single one." He paused, letting the words settle. "Mr. Caldwell could. Because 50 years ago, those skills weren't optional. They were the difference between life and death. And last night, they were the difference between you making it back to this camp and a search and rescue operation that would have ended careers." Colonel Webb announced 2 immediate changes that morning. First, the battalion would implement a mandatory Celestial Navigation and Terrain Association block of instruction in every future training cycle, with Mr. Caldwell invited to serve as the primary guest instructor. Second, every Marine in the platoon would complete a GPS-denied navigation exercise before the end of the quarter, evaluated to the same standards that Pathfinder candidates were held to in 1968. Ray was asked to design the course. He accepted quietly, the same way he did everything. Over the following weeks, something shifted in the battalion that went beyond training schedules and lesson plans. Ray became a fixture at the camp. Marines sought him out, not just for navigation tips, but for everything. How to read weather from cloud formations, how to estimate distance using sound delay, how to find water in terrain that looked bone dry. He taught them things that no manual covered and no digital system could replicate. He taught them how to think when the technology stopped thinking for them. Vega became one of his most dedicated students. The young lance corporal who had laughed at the old man's compass now carried one of his own, a gift from Ray, along with a small notebook where he recorded every lesson. One evening, sitting outside the barracks after a long day of training, Vega asked Ray why he had volunteered for the mentorship program in the first place. Ray was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because I spent 50 years carrying skills that nobody asked about. I figured if I didn't pass them on, they'd die with me." Vega looked at the compass in his hand. "They won't," he said. Ray looked at him, and for the first time since anyone could remember, the old pathfinder smiled. 6 months later, Holt's platoon scored the highest marks in the regiment on the GPS denied navigation evaluation. Every single Marine passed. The course had been designed by Ray Caldwell, graded to Pathfinder standards, and completed under conditions that would have been considered demanding even in 1968. Colonel Webb presented the results at a regimental briefing and made a point of noting that the initiative had been born not from a planning committee or a doctrinal review, but from one night in the desert when an old man with a broken compass did what 43 Marines with modern technology could not. After the briefing, Webb found Ray standing outside the headquarters building, looking up at the sky the way he always did, reading the stars like a language only he still spoke. "Mr. Caldwell," the colonel said, "how does it feel to be the reason an entire battalion changed its training program?" Ray looked at him with those steady, quiet eyes. "Doesn't feel like anything, sir. I just showed them what the sky already knew." Webb nodded slowly. "You know, the brigadier general who wrote that note in your file, he told me one more thing about you." "What's that?" "He said you never once asked for recognition. Not for the Silver Star, not for the men you saved, not for any of it." Ray looked back at the sky. "The stars don't ask for recognition either, Colonel. They just do their job, every night, whether anyone's looking or not. Some people carry skills that the world has moved past. They walk quietly through a civilization that has traded knowledge for convenience, wisdom for bandwidth, and hard-won experience for a signal from a satellite. And then one night, the satellite goes dark, the screen goes blank, the signal disappears. And in that silence, in that darkness, the only thing standing between chaos and safety is a man who never forgot how to read the sky." Ray Caldwell didn't need technology to find his way. He never had. He was a Pathfinder, and Pathfinders always find the way home. If this story reminded you that real skills never become obsolete, subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories of veterans whose service didn't end when they took off the uniform. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because the stars are still up there, waiting for someone to look up.